Hello, thank you so much. Yes, go ahead, student host, please take it over. Shnavi.
A very good morning, everyone. Now we begin our next in conversation session on inclusivity in education, the urban-rural divide with Ms. Nisha Vernekar. I, Vaishnavi Tiwari, takes great pleasure to introduce Ms. Nisha Vernekar. Ma'am is a team leader in the area of education at the Vidhi Center for Legal Policy, New Delhi. The team works on questions of inclusive education with previous area of focus including the exclusion of children with disabilities from education, equitable early childhood education, and the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on delivery of and access to education. Ma'am has completed her post-graduation from SOS University of London with MSc in Development Economics and received her bachelor's degree in economics from Symbiosis School of Economics. Prior to Vidhi, Ma'am has worked as a project coordinator and research assistant at the Institute for Fiscal Studies, London, and Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, respectively, on multiple projects relating to early childhood and elementary education, education policy, and gender. Some of these projects include working on understanding implementation of Right to Education Act in Ahmedabad, parental preferences for private schools among low-income households, and the impact of free school curriculum and pedagogical intervention in Anganwadis in rural Odisha. Ma'am regularly writes on topics of gender and education for media outlets such as The Wire, Ideas for India, and Quint, among others. Thank you, ma'am, for your time. Moving towards a brief introduction to the notion of inclusive education. As mentioned by the United Nations Children's Fund, the world's population is migrating to its cities. Migrants are leaving the agricultural lifestyle on the lookout for better financial and academic opportunities, most often settling in non notified slums. These children and their families lead unpredictable and transitory lifestyles following seasonal labor, moving to pursue temporary work, or leaving when authorities query their right to their home. When the youth switch habitations and schooling, they omit essential content material and, in case of India, are compelled to grasp overseas languages quickly to adopt to the local medium of instructions. The All India Education Survey conducted by NCRT has a separate urban information forum, but no efforts is made to understand the urban education problems in this integrated way. In this session, we would now like to throw some light on the pioneering work done by independent organizations such as Vidhi Center towards ensuring inclusive education. Thank you everyone for joining in. And with this, I would now like to hand over the mic to our faculty moderator, Ms. Vidya Tewani.
Thank you so much, Vaishnavi. In case my voice drops, please let me know immediately. Just unmute yourself and let me know that my voice is not loud enough. Thank you so much, Nisha, for joining us today for this in conversation. Also, Nisha, there was something that we were trying to figure out with reference to the background. So maybe we could take a pause here
Sure,
and yeah, we could take a pause and first have that in
sure,
place.
sure. Yeah, that
Yeah,
would be great.
yeah,
So I think there was,
yeah. My student host is giving you. Yeah, yeah.
hello.
We request our participants to be patient with us. We'll start in a moment. Thank you. We are going to begin our second in conversation in a few moments. Please stay logged in.
Hi, I'm so sorry about that delay.
No, we are sorry. We had to change a few settings in our, at our backstage, so to say. Now we are ready to go. Right?
Yeah, that's it.
Great. So let me take this opportunity to formally welcome you to our conference and thank you so much for joining us. So, Nisha, my first question, taking from Vaishnavi's introduction, that we are going to talk about the urban-rural divide. And interestingly and very usefully, recently, Vidhi Center for Legal Policy on 1st of October launched a report very effectively talked about the use of the role of parents, teachers, and technology in enhancing homeschooling, if I can use the word, in the backdrop of COVID-19 pandemic and working from home and also studying from home. So would you like to tell us a little more about this report?
Yeah, absolutely. Firstly, Vidya, thank you so much for having me, and to the audience, I hope I can make this an interesting session for everyone. So, with respect to this study on EC, if I can give a little bit of background on why we wanted to do this study to begin with. So, EC, early childhood education, which is basically the formal schooling for 3 to 6 year olds, is really something that over the last 10 to 15 years has been established globally as incredibly important for the holistic development of children. And not only is it important for cognitive development, we see sort of steep learning curves in those early years. So for cognitive development, socio-emotional learning, language skills, numeracy, basically all the foundational skills that children develop, there's really a steep learning curve in the early years. But what's also incredibly important is that evidence shows that this has gains for children that are long lasting. So it really, access to high quality early childhood education really impacts the learning capabilities of children throughout their schooling lifetimes. And in fact, recent evidence found that it even impacts future earning capabilities. So, with ECE being something so crucial, we felt it was very important to kind of.
Sorry, could we tell our participants what EC stands for, to kind of
Oh,
give
sure,
them.
sure. I'm
So,
so sorry. Yeah. So ECE is basically early childhood education. So it is the formal schooling stage for 3 to 6 year old children, which basically comes before they join first grade, right? Before they join primary schooling. So that's really what ECE is about. And in the Indian legislation, so if you look at the RT Act, Section 11, if I'm not wrong, talks about sort of providing universal uh, early childhood education, but it's not something that has been elaborated on beyond that. And it's something that is only now getting attention in, I guess, the way that it should be with the NEP 2020, right? So the NEP 2020 devotes an entire chapter to talking about the importance of early childhood education. So all these things that I'm saying, the steep learning curve, the NEP specifically cites a study that says 85% of the cognitive development of a child happens in the first 6 years of their life, right? So that's really what we're talking about here when we say early childhood education. But yeah, so is that enough? I could elaborate a little bit more. That's good. Yeah. Yeah. So despite the importance of early childhood education, as I said, even prior to the pandemic, early childhood education was being provided through Anganwadi centers. Okay, they are the primary provider of preschooling in India. And Anganwadi centers, under the ICDS scheme, they basically do multiple responsibilities where early childhood education is only one, right? So really in the larger context of ECE delivery, you don't have a lot of priority on ECE, and only now is the NEP kind of pushing for that prioritization, right? So what we really wanted to study is that despite this importance of EC that is well established now, and that is increasingly being recognized for its importance for the overall development of children, there has been very little conversation and very little evidence on what has happened to EC delivery during the pandemic, right? And like I said, even prior to the pandemic, in Anganwadi centers, there are studies that found that instructional time of children in preschool was as low as 20 to 30 minutes per day, right? This is prior to the pandemic for the children who were actually going to Anganwadis. So not only are we, we don't have 100% enrollment in Anganwadis or in preschools, but even those who are going were only getting such little instructional time, right? So given all of that, and given the fact that since the pandemic, since school closures, Anganwadis, preschools, schools for younger children have been the first to close down. And even now, very few states have even spoken about reopening that, right? So we really wanted to understand what has been the status of ECE. We specifically studied it, as you mentioned, Vidya, in the context of low-income, under-resourced households in urban tier 1 cities. So we looked at children in Mumbai and Pune who were specifically enrolled in EC programs that are sort of dedicated to the delivery of EC. So in some sense, these were kind of within low-income households, advantaged households, right? Because they had the benefit of living in tier 1 cities where there is high penetration of smartphones and internet connectivity. So our sample, for example, had almost 98% access to smartphones, which is, of course, not the case, right? We know from the recent school survey that happened, I think in urban areas, only 24% had access to digital devices for education. And I think in rural, that was as low as 8%. This is the Genres Ritika Khera school survey that happened a couple of months ago. But yeah, so in our case, we're looking at low-income households, but who did have access to digital devices despite being disadvantaged. And what we found was that, because they have to share devices, because they are under-resourced, they still have to share devices amongst children. And we found that 45% of our households were preferring the education or prioritizing education of their older children over ECE, right? So yeah, I mean, these were some of the kinds of things that we sort of understood from this study, which is that despite the importance of EC, despite the new sort of attention that's being paid to it, as far as households are concerned, maybe that priority is not clear or the importance of EC is not clear enough. And then I think that is also reflected in the way the state has kind of approached the question of continuing early childhood education during the pandemic, right? There really has been very little said about reopening schools and I mean for preschools and Anganwadis. And even if you look at, say, the government moved everything to the Diksha platform, which is this digital resource of content for, across age groups. But that Diksha platform, which has been touted as being, the most important source of digital education during COVID, does not have EC content. So that really reflects something about the kind of importance that's being given to this stage of schooling. Yeah.
Okay, great. It also it did talk in great detail about the role of parents and their preference over male child education, female child education. Would you like to talk a little bit about that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So you are right. With our study, what we really focused on was the role of parents, because when COVID happened and school closures, more importantly, COVID will continue, school closures are the problem. So with school closures, the site of education shifted into the household, right? And for older grades, for older children, digital education is still something that many can engage with independently if they have access, right? But for this early childhood, this age group of 3 to 6 year olds, you can imagine you can't give them a phone and expect them to learn independently, right? So you really do need a parent to be sitting alongside to understand how to help the child and to engage and facilitate their learning. So this is why we focused on what is the role of parents been and how have teachers, models that utilize technology been able to help parents facilitate and engage with their child for early childhood education. So specifically this gender divide that you're talking about, our study actually did not find a gender gap for this age group, right? However, there is sort of evidence across the board that there is a gender divide, and we can definitely go into that in a little bit more detail, maybe in the coming questions as well. But yeah, our specific study didn't talk about that. What we did talk about is, these households, because they are low income and under-resourced, you have parents that are not very well educated themselves, who have largely not done early childhood education themselves. They might not even have an older child who has been in EC. So really then what we're asking of them is to understand and understand the value of a whole new stage of education, one,
Mm.
and two, understand how to interact with your children and how to teach your children, right? Which is a huge ask from someone who has not been a part of this process before, who doesn't know what EC is about and why it's important. And then specifically for these low-income, under-resourced households, there are also the additional stressors that came with the pandemic itself, right? So many of them, I mean, there was sort of rampant job losses. Many had, migrated back to rural areas, so they lost that little advantage of internet connectivity that they might have had in the cities. So we had like teachers telling us that really we understand the importance of parental engagement. We're trying to get them to engage with their children by, calling them or doing WhatsApp classes and this and that. But really, it's a matter of these households having the time, the capacity, and the understanding of how to actually facilitate their children's learning in an effective way, right? And then being able to prioritize that as well. So so this is kind of what we spoke about when it comes to parental engagement. And I think this is a really important part to highlight, because yes, for early childhood education, it's very important because the child can't learn independently. But if you look at studies on learning outcomes, right, across the board, but especially in like primary grades as well, you really find that a parent's ability to engage or parental education determines a large part of the learning outcomes of children. So because of this, even where children are, say you have a group of children who are all attending a school together, children with more educated parents are more likely to do well in school, right? So it's really like this intergenerational disadvantage that you need to try to break through and address in some way.
Yeah, quite thought-provoking that way also, So taking from there, as you said, that, it is likely that, children of educated parents are more likely to continue education or to enroll in one to begin with. And also in the backdrop of RTE with 25% reservation, and also seeing children as economic assets in urban poor families, how would you like to explain to our listeners today, some of the significant reasons for dropouts? So
Right.
could
So, I mean, contextualizing this within the Right to Education Act makes a lot of sense, right? Because when you talk about dropouts, like even before you can talk about dropouts, there are these other stages that you have to achieve, right? So, uh, before you get to dropouts, there is enrollment, then there is attendance and learning once a child is coming into school. And then you have this problem of, okay, they've been coming, they've been maybe learning, but they are still dropping out, right? And really, to understand the reasons behind dropouts, we can kind of look at two sides of this problem, right? There are supply side constraints, which is essentially, availability of schools. So, for example, in many rural areas, you have primary schooling, and then even fifth grade and above is just not available. There is no physical school that is close enough, right? So this is a supply side problem that the state needs to solve, right? And then on the other hand, you have the demand side problem, which is essentially, are parents valuing education? Do they want to send their children to school? And I think it's very clear that across the board, yes, they do. They do want to send their children to school. They do want to keep their children in school. They do understand the value of that. Maybe not for ECE so much yet, but it's developing. But definitely for primary school, right? So then what kind of happens is where you see dropouts, etc., it's largely a function of some sort of socioeconomic disadvantage that is forcing the hand of parents, right? So if I can just, coming back to the RT. So what the RT really does is that it says that you need compulsory elementary education, and this is the right of a child, right? In order to operationalize this, the RT, couple of things that it does. For example, it solves the supply side problem by saying that we need primary schools in every 1 kilometer radius. We need secondary schools in every 5 kilometer radius, right? So that then solves the supply side problem, especially for communities that are sort of in remote areas or that don't have access to transport, for example, right? Similarly, the 5 kilometer radius for secondary schools solves the problem for many girls who are, say, unable to access transport. But if you have a school that is close enough, then safety is less of a concern. So parents are still willing to send their girl child to the secondary school because of this, right? So that's how the RT kind of solves for the supply side problem. On the demand side problem, the RT is essentially saying this is the right of a child. Legally, you have to put your child in elementary school, right? So we shouldn't really be seeing dropouts, at least for the elementary education stage, which is 1st to 8th grade. And this is also one of the reasons why you see almost 100% enrollment in primary school. But then you start to see dropouts for a variety of reasons. And it starts with the problem of, even though we're near 100% attendance, 100% enrollment, how many children are regularly attending school, right? And if they're not regularly attending, what are the reasons behind this, right? And these reasons, of course, like you pointed out, they're going to be different for different children, right? So for girl children, and if you were to just compare girl and boy children, for example, right, especially those in low income households, if households are forced to basically in like a destitute position, right, where there is job loss, or like a breadwinner has recently passed away or lost a job, this kind of economic shock can propel a household to pull out their boy child, their male child, from schooling and put them into paid work, right? Similarly, for a girl child in a similar circumstance, rather than paid work, they might be asked to stay at home to take care of their younger siblings, right? So to take on the care work burden of the household if their parents are sort of out engaged in paid work. So the reasons for why children are dropping out are different, right? But what the RT had actually achieved was that we had gotten this 100% enrollment, and we were, really minimizing the number of people dropping out. As far as, it was basically only like in exceptional cases, right? We were moving towards that, where children were only dropping out when they were really forced to, right? But with COVID, we've kind of gone backward in time, right? Because of this digital divide, what has really happened is now so many children just don't have access to digital devices or internet connectivity, which means that they have technically dropped out, right? Over the last 18 months, those many children have not been in school, and it's no longer an exceptional case. It's almost the majority in so many ways that have dropped out, right? So yeah, essentially with the question of dropouts, we need to bring it back to the understanding of what are the demand side constraints, what are the supply side constraints, and then constantly trying to solve for that, right? So similarly, once you talk about, say, attendance, right? A supply side problem of attendance, for example, is teacher absenteeism, right? Now, teacher absenteeism is something that, again, we've seen a lot of reports talk about this as being a problem. But if you look at the systemic issue behind teacher absenteeism, it's largely due to undue administrative burdens on teachers. So teachers are not just playing the role of teachers, but they are also providing, all social security schemes to households. They are also doing, say, what's it called, election duty, right? So there are, and very interestingly, so I've worked in, Section 12(1)(c) of the Right to Education Act, which is basically a reservation for economically weaker and disadvantaged sections of society in private schools, right? So it's an opportunity for these children to actually access a private school that are considered to be of higher quality, and many parents demand for that but can't afford it. And what was really interesting to us is that this process of admission that happens for Section 12(1)(c) in private schools, that process of application is done in government schools. So which means for 3 months, when enrollments are happening for private schools, your government school teachers can't teach, right? So it's like constantly creating these additional barriers for teachers to be present and to be able to give that kind of time, right? So this is a huge supply side constraint. And if you have children in government schools coming into empty classrooms without teachers because teachers are off doing all these other things that they're being asked to do, of course you're going to see attendance falter, right? Of course you're going to see parents lose faith in the government schooling system or not see the value in sending their child to do. Might as well keep them at home, let them help with chores, right? Or let them go earn some money. Anyway, they're enrolled. So these are the kinds of issues that happen and that need to be addressed, right? On both sides, the demand and the supply side. They really do need to come together when we're sort of addressing these constraints. And then finally, if I can just add, I know I'm like taking a long time, but if I can just add, so even once you have attendance, we do know that the next biggest problem is this question of learning, right? So even children who are enrolled, so they're being able to access the school, they've enrolled in the school, they're even attending regularly, but are they learning, right? What is the quality of the teaching learning, and are they being able to gain from that process? And this really like highlights the importance of sort of early childhood education again, right? Because like I said, if you don't have a strong foundation, what happens is that, and you can look at like ASER surveys, right? You see that fifth grade, like third graders, fifth graders, eighth graders aren't being able to read simple sentences, like 4-word, 5-word sentences, right? So imagine, right? If you can't read a simple sentence and you're in eighth grade, how are you going to learn science? Right. So it's that foundational learning crisis in early years is really what sort of, it sort of accumulates over time and then leads to dropouts because you have children sitting in classrooms who are completely blank, who don't have any foundational literacy and numeracy, and they don't have sufficient support to help them catch up either. And as a result, they're not learning in a classroom. They're just sitting there, right? And so that is, again, a huge reason for why there are so many dropouts, especially at that secondary age stage. Yeah, sorry, yeah, if you have
No,
more.
I was so engrossed and I was actually, is my voice echoing?
No,
No.
that's
Yeah.
good.
I was so engrossed and I was trying to draw a mental, map of what you were saying. And I must say, Nisha, that you've been unfolding for us layers that are not unknown to us, but we've not received them in this manner. The charts that you drew for us, and you touched upon the role of the administration. So there's a policy in place, let's say RTE, and everything is in place from the side of the parents and the children. But then, there is something administrative which is kind of leading to issues. And that also connects us to how the policies are executed. So there is an RTE or even Diksha that you mentioned, and many others that you've really been working very deeply on. So would you like to tell our listeners, how are these policies inclusive, and do they lead to the outcomes that are intended? What are the hurdles? And sorry, I'm embedding the question, and also the role of independent think tanks who are working very hard, like with the Center for Legal Policy, and what kind of reports do they bring to the government to kind of make it more inclusive and effective?
Right, absolutely. So, okay, so again, to sort of broadly talk about it, right? I think the first question that we constantly ask ourselves is when we say we want to make education policy in India inclusive, what do we really mean, right? What does that mean? So on paper, very simply, you're sort of saying that you want that access, experience, outcome piece that I just spoke about, right? You want that to be equal and universal for all children, right? Inclusive of all children. So you want all children to be able to enroll in a school. You want all of them to be able to regularly attend, because it is a question of being able, right? It's not that no one, it's not that anyone doesn't want to. It's really being them being forced to choose between this versus that, right? So being able to attend regularly, then being able to learn well, and then that sort of leading to sufficient learning outcomes that they can then use to move to higher grades, continue to learn effectively, and then into the job market, right? So really, this is how you sort of look at it. But when you talk about the policy making process, right, it's not a linear thing. So at any given point of time, what's really happening is that you have people who are saying, okay, these are the problems that we've identified. Like I said, the demand side and supply side constraints that we've identified. Now, can we think about ways in which we can address these, right? And because each of these demand and supply side constraints are different for different groups, for different people, and in different localities. So the problems of, say, urban poor and rural poor are going to be very, very different, right? Even if they have comparable income levels, you really need to say that, okay, we've understood these problems, and then what are the different ways in which we can address these problems, right? So that's the starting point. But then once you've sort of written that down and you've said, these are the ideas, what you then need to do is it needs to be sent off to, say, states. They need to then interpret that. That then needs to be written into some sort of action plan or implementation plan. Then there is this process of implementation that needs to happen. And then finally, you can sort of try to evaluate whether this idea that you had has then been successful in achieving inclusion, right? So it's a long process, and I'm describing it as linear, but it really isn't, right? It's a continuous cycle. And really what needs to happen for inclusion is that along each step of this way, you need to have these feedback loops, right? You need to be able to go back to whoever it is, a policy maker, a bureaucrat, and the person who's designing implementation plans, the person who's actually implementing it on the ground, and then to the parents itself, and ask this question of, is this working? If this is not working, why isn't it working, right? So is the barrier or the constraint that you have being alleviated? And if not, how can we improve that process? And even in doing this, right, this entire process needs to be, like the process of providing feedback itself needs to be inclusive. So a lot of the times what we see is that, you have people like, and I mean, I'm saying this as someone who works at a center like Vidhi, right? So Vidhi is a think tank that's based in New Delhi. And if you look at some of our reports, we're talking about sort of, rural poor in Kerala and Tamil Nadu. So that was a report we had put out in December. So it's very easy to turn around and ask me the question of, how has your report been inclusive, right? What is the basis on which you are giving this feedback? And so this is kind of what we try to do in going to the most decentralized stakeholder, whether that's, we start with sort of the parent, the child. We try to talk to the, say, ward commissioners, the most sort of decentralized level at which a policy is implemented, right? We try to talk to CSOs that are very well embedded in this space, who are trying to support the state in providing services. Then we try to talk to the policymakers, to people higher up who are maybe ideating, and we try to sort of bring this loop together to say, okay, what was the problem of inclusion, and have we been able to get to it, right? So I mean, really, this process is what becomes really important to understand when you talk about trying to make policies more inclusive, right? Just, are you being able to make the process of understanding the policy and its impact itself inclusive? Because if you don't do that, we don't know. And the reason this is so important is because when you sort of sit up in New Delhi and try to talk about rural Tamil Nadu, what can happen is that you're unable to sort of, situate your idea within the social, cultural, economic, political context of the people that you're trying to help or that you're trying to include, right? So, for example, right, we spoke about this problem of, I'll give you two examples here. So we spoke about the problem of, girl children dropping out of school because the school was a little bit far away, right? And I think it was in Bihar where they tried this policy of, let's give secondary what's it called, secondary grade girl children cycles, right, to go to school. So we'll give them a cycle. This is the policy. We're going to invest in that. All children in this age group in rural areas get a cycle. And we really saw that being a success. So parents were happy. You were addressing the safety concern. They were being able to go to school and they were being able to come back. And you didn't see dropouts fall, as in dropouts reduced, right, or retention increased in secondary grades. On the other hand, if you look at the example of midday meals, right, um, so there has been a huge case of, let's include eggs in midday meals. Now, midday meals are very, very important for the nutrition of children. In fact, they're being used as a way to get children into schools, incentivize them to come to school, right? And a lot of nutritionists, health experts, everyone was saying include eggs for a variety of reasons. They're cheaper for the government. They can't be adulterated. They're high in protein. They're very good for health. So many positive reasons. So on paper, this is a wonderful idea, right? There's no reason not to do this. But in so many states, there is a cultural context to which eggs are offensive, right? In pure vegetarian communities, you have both, people and in many cases, parents are still okay with it, but you have a political climate and you have a sort of larger cultural context in which it's unacceptable to provide eggs. So you have entire states where eggs cannot be given in midday meals and they're not given, right? Whereas in states like Orissa, you still get eggs given. So, I mean, this is what really needs to happen when we say make it inclusive so you can understand the context in which you're trying to implement it. Because otherwise, you write something, it's a fantastic idea, it works in some settings, but it can't be implemented elsewhere. And that's what fails, right? So, this is really what we try to do it with you, if I can try to bring it back, right? So, we start with saying there is this policy. On paper, firstly, is it inclusive, right? Then is it inclusive? That is like a very academic exercise to say, okay, has this group been included? Have you spoken about this group? Has this constraint that we know about been included in here and, directly addressed, right? So that's step one. And then you try to talk to each of those decentralized stakeholders to understand their experience. Because even when, sorry, can I give one more example if we're not running out of time?
Please do. No, no, we are not.
Okay. So, for example, right, a way in which girl children have been incentivized to attend schools is through these conditional cash transfer schemes, right? Which is basically where you're telling a parent that if you enroll your child in school, I will give you this bond. And if your child completes or stays in school till 8th grade or 10th grade, you will get a sum of X amount, right? Now we did this study in Gujarat. It was part of this, study we did with UNICEF. This is when I was working with IMA. And what we found was that, on paper, this conditional cash transfer scheme makes a lot of sense. There's evidence globally that this works. But when actually implementing it, the amount of money that was being paid to these parents at the end of 8 or 10 years of schooling that you were asking them to complete for their girl child was only rupees 2,000. And parents were saying, honestly, the sum is so low, I forgot. I forgot that I had, enrolled in this scheme. So my child dropped out, or my child, is working now or taking care of her siblings now. So this is why then that feedback loop becomes so important, because on paper it's happening. You have enough evidence, from elsewhere to say this is effective. But then is that actual sum of money that you're giving good enough, right? But yeah, sorry. So that was the last example. But yeah, so this is essentially what we try to do in moving towards more inclusive policies. Yeah.
Yeah, and these examples were actually very useful. I'm sure our listeners are also benefiting from this, to kind of see it as illustrative level. If I can deduce from, your response to my question, is that we are talking about there is a centralized policy that there is a decision that has been taken, probably taking into consideration as many stakeholders and as many possibilities as possible, and then there is an execution of the policy which needs kind of localization to kind of understand grassroots. And then now, in response to that, would you like to throw some light on NEP now?
Right. I mean, yeah, actually, the NEP is the perfect example because we're at like point one, right, with the NEP. So NEP is essentially a vision document, right? So even when it talks about inclusion, it does dedicate an entire chapter to inclusion, right? And it talks about socially and economically disadvantaged groups and like specific ways to sort of address their challenges. Then it talks about instituting a gender inclusion fund. So as a vision document, this is what the NEP can do, right? There's only so much it can do. Now, the next step is really for each state to say, okay, if I get a gender inclusion fund, right? One is ask questions about how much that is going to be, which is very arbitrary at the moment, but so start there. But also they have to then say, okay, what are the girls in my state, right? The girl children in my state, what are their constraints? What are their, what are the largest constraints? And of course, at the end of the day, any state or, any policy, the financial backing to it is limited, right? You don't have enough money. It's the basic economic problem. You never have enough money to solve all problems at once. So it is unfortunately a problem prioritizing this problem versus the other. And like, yeah, it's morally maybe not the best thing, but this is what you have to do. There are constraints. So, what the states need to do is then say that for my state, what is the problem of the girl child? How can a gender inclusion fund address that? In sort of deciding what those state rules are, which is really where we are with the NEP right now, each individual state has been asked to create implementation panels to devise plans for how they're going to implement different aspects of the NEP, right? So at the moment, I think the priority has become higher education. So I think Karnataka, Maharashtra, a couple of other states have already started, with their NEP implementation panels. So now what is really going to happen, or like how we are going to be able to assess whether the NEP is going to successfully improve inclusion for different marginalized groups is really now based on these implementation plans, right? It's how the states and then the implementation panels within the states understand their own problems and interpret what the NEP has said, right, to be able to address those problems. That's really where we're at. With the NEP, I mean, I think there are some sort of unanimous positives, at least in my eyes. And like I said earlier, one of them is definitely the focus on early childhood education. It's something that is long overdue. You have organizations and academics like Pratham and Ambedkar University, CSED. These people have been sort of advocating for this for years, right? For 10, 20 years. So it's really, I think, only positive that something like ECE has been given as much attention in the NEP. And I think that can have repercussions for inclusion, for generations really, because like I said, it's an intergenerational problem. But again, so the NEP talks about early childhood education delivery and making it universal and accessible by 2026, 27 is the target. But then they also have another chapter on foundational literacy and numeracy, where the entire idea behind that is by third grade, all children should have achieved foundational literacy and numeracy. Again, on paper, fantastic. That's very positive, right? And it really is sort of trying to directly address that learning crisis problem that we spoke about. That's sort of the motivation behind that. However, if you look at the Nipun Bharat scheme, which is what the Education Department has just come out with in 2021 as a way to reach foundational literacy and numeracy, interestingly, they don't talk about early childhood education in reaching foundational literacy and numeracy, which is very confusing because if you look at overall the question of when do you build the foundations, you're saying in the same document, the same NEP is telling you that 85% of cognitive development and about 90% of learning opportunities happen in the 3 to 6 year age group. But you've taken the FLNP separate of EC, and you said, let's implement this. Let's implement this from first to third grade and get you foundational literacy